A draw at Stoke wrapped in mitigation, context, subplots. We're going to do our best to untangle them all, weave through the accounts, and also talk a little bit about an Arsenal legend potentially joining Norwich City. It's certainly not going to be a show short on topics. Welcome to the latest edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. I'm your host, Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy Davitt and Sam Seaman, fresh-faced after what was quite a long day yesterday with various delays and traffic and weather on the way to Stoke, and of course the small matter of that 1-1 draw as well. So recording this on Sunday afternoon, as we do with our pods away from home, and you're very welcome. Thank you very much for tuning in wherever you are and on whichever platform you are consuming us at this very moment, and I hope it finds you well. Paddy, interesting day, wasn't it? Just all round, even before we maybe get to the result and the way that unfolded on the pitch. What is your feeling sat here? Had obviously some time to reflect and to sleep on what happened yesterday. What's kind of your reflections this morning on, first and foremost, I guess, the result and probably the performance at the Bet365 Stadium?
I'd probably chime in with how Johannes broke it down immediately after the game, if I'm honest, which was, I think we were there, we felt the same. First half, continuation of a theme, albeit interspersed with a 2-week lull for the international fixtures, but very, very similar to Hull in terms of the control, the composure through the middle areas of the pitch. And no doubt a lot of that was down to a certain presence for Chilean in Marcelino Nunez, who was thankfully, at least yesterday, able to overcome those hamstring-related issues. Sadly, we'll get into, he may have gone down again with another cycle of scans and severity of an injury that, in all probability, we won't see him for Preston. But for me, it's how long thereafter he's missing. But keeping it back to Saturday at Stoke, him in there, Slimani again, more evidence of what he's about, quality operator on the ball. You look at the best moments in that first half, when Norwich were able to work lots of space with the speed of their passing, their transitional moments, and he was at the hub of a lot of their best work. He was involved, obviously, in the goal. And that great chance for Nunez around about the 22nd minute mark as well. That was really his vision, and obviously the run from Nunez. So McLean, again, I thought was good as well. So those three, for me, that set the tone. That first half, Norwich, I mean, they ended up with 60-plus possession in their favour, but it was certainly that in the first half, and that control was evident in a very composed performance. I mean, there was one moment of alarm, I think, prior to their very late equaliser in the first half, but 3 minutes in, when Cannon has run off the back of Cordoba and got an angled shot off, which George Long was able to get down to. But that aside, up until the point they equalised, I thought it was all Norwich, and very hard to see how it would be anything other than a Norwich win, particularly when they got their noses in front. It then turned off the back of the equaliser. Start of the second half, Stoke, maybe because of the confidence they got from getting back on level terms, but they started far more aggressively. They had more energy about them, I thought, collectively. Pinned Norwich back, and that for me was very like Derby. If you go back to that away game, the start of that second half, and Derby equalised that day. Norwich weathered that, came through out the other end and got the goals they needed to win the game, and obviously then repelled another late riposte from Derby in stoppage time that day. But we didn't get that yesterday. We got quite a weary, laboured, lethargic performance, I think, and you can't look too far beyond the international element in that equation. Josh Sargent, for example, that's not to single him out, but he was way off what we normally associate with him and have done in this recent run. But where's he been in the intervening fortnight? He's been off to America and then down to Mexico. A lot of minutes, a lot of miles, a lot of travel. And he was symptomatic, I think, of, I mean, to be fair, Johannes did try and freshen it up from the bench, introduced quite a number of players, but never really, you had that sense it would end in a sort of Derby conclusion. So ultimately, they walk away with a point. I think the point was a fair result on the balance of the game. A little bit of frustration because they didn't build on that first half, really. But at the start of a very gruelling spell of 4 games on the road in 5, and given I thought Stoke did improve, that won't feel, probably as we put a bit of distance between the result, a bad result, really. But it's just, you're left with a sense in the immediate aftermath that there was probably a win there for the taking, particularly on the basis of how they set that game up in the first half.
Yeah, and I think it's probably one of those rare occasions where both managers post match probably sensed that that there was an opportunity maybe for both sides to win. But Sam, I mean, we obviously and maybe there are similarities between this game and Swansea, or maybe that's too simplistic to make. But that game. And for some of the reasons Paddy outlined in terms of Josh Sargent, he was in Mexico on Wednesday night, doesn't return to England until Thursday. We're probably expecting, then gets thrown in and has to go on a coach up to Stoke to play on a Saturday. All of that does provide. I think you could really understand maybe why it wasn't his best afternoon. Although he did get an assist with his face, which was quite amusing, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. But that, I think, example encapsulates how difficult these first games back can be from international breaks, because it isn't just him. There are other players who have been playing all over the place at all different times, in all different time zones. It's a really difficult one to navigate. And I think Stoke, by all accounts, they had 11 players away for international duty, but they still had considerably more of the squad available to Narcis Pelach over this break than Johannes Thorup had. So a difficult fixture to sort of navigate in that context as well from a physical perspective. So given that, I guess we've probably sat here today looking at the point, feeling it's not the worst thing in the world that they've come out of that Nunez injury and obviously avoiding defeat. Otherwise, pretty unscathed.
Yeah, I suppose it's one of the prices you have to pay for going out and recruiting some of the young talent in different markets that maybe others aren't looking at. You look at the squad that Norwich had last season, and with the number of experienced EFL operators that they had in that squad, there certainly wasn't the same sense that, although there were a couple going to South America and things like that, that you had players going all over the world and then coming back with various levels of jet lag 2 days before the game started. But obviously in the overall picture, that's only, I think, what 4 games this season that Norwich will be coming back from international breaks. And although 3 of them fall within a fairly short space of time, that's not really a major problem in the context of a 46-game championship season. And so, yeah, when you look at some of the problems that created for Norwich, and the fact that it's an away game, first and foremost, it's against a Stoke side that certainly are feeling more optimistic, you suggest, given some of their recent results and their recent performances. It looks like they're headed in the right direction as well. And they have that intimate knowledge of Norwich's tactics and what they're trying to do, given Narcis Pelach's involvement in the club, obviously, so recently. I think it got to the point in the second half where most Norwich fans would have been happy with the point, and then post-match where they weren't too upset about it. It felt like going into it, it was a game that Norwich could win. And if they were to continue the trajectory that they've been on in the last few weeks, that maybe that was certainly possible. But I think it did get to a point where you actually started to rationalise why it wasn't as easy as some of the games in recent weeks, why there was mitigation around it. And ultimately, it feels like one that won't live long in the memory in either a positive sense or a negative sense for Norwich, which maybe for us as the media isn't the most exciting thing or the best thing for us. But I think for Norwich, especially given the quick turnaround that they've got now and the opportunities that they have in very short order to put things right, I certainly don't think it's the end of the world. And I'd say that's probably the sentiment that I'm getting from across the fan base at the moment.
Yeah, unfortunately, in seasons that are 46 games long, you can't win every game. So it is, I think, about as much as you can retaining that momentum and keeping yourself ticking over, as Norwich have done. And that means at points you have to sort of accept there are going to be games where actually you do have to accept a point. And I think maybe the not to keep referring to last season as a point, but certainly with their away form of what they did away from home, I think when that momentum shifted as it did yesterday, it's the type of game I think they probably would have just fallen on the wrong end of last season. So the fact that they were able to survive it and get through it and endure it almost, I think maybe is a positive. And I guess for as much as we kind of and we're speaking about Josh Sargent a lot in this opening piece. I think we could list several other players, but he's a really pertinent example maybe of Stoke as well, because as much as we talk about Norwich, there are always 2 teams on the pitch, and Stoke made life very difficult for them. They put bodies in the middle of the pitch, and I think that's documented by how little Norwich City got him the ball. 20 touches for him throughout the game yesterday, which is the fewest of any Norwich City starters. Actually, next one above him is Borja Sainz with 24. Now, for context, a man called Forson, who was on the pitch for 26 minutes, Emiliano Marcondes, who was on the pitch for 26 minutes, both recorded more than Josh Sargent. But I think, Paddy, that points at maybe some of the frustration that Norwich probably had, but equally the job that Stoke did to really contain those two in particular, but probably limit Norwich in central areas where they've been so dangerous in recent weeks.
Yeah, but both elements of that hold true. I mean, we're not breaching any confidences, but we sort of discovered that Pelach had some very lengthy tactical meetings in the run into Norwich. Not that he would have thought he'd needed too much refresher about Norwich and how they set up and their weapons and how to nullify them. But one anecdote of a 7-hour tactical meeting with his analysts. So I wouldn't like to be one of his analysts, is all I would say. Lots of double sessions.
People think an hour of this is too much.
Say again, mate?
People think an hour of this is too much, let alone 7 hours of tactical analysis.
Yeah, not wrong. Yeah, if you persevere for an hour, you deserve a medal listening to us, but that's by the by. But yeah, I mean, and all of that would lead you to see what we saw in terms of how they frustrated Norwich. Science is a good case in point. There was a few quotes from Narcis about, I don't think he quite intended it to come across as it maybe read, that it was almost down to him, his trajectory, and how he almost identified the player, wanted him in at Huddersfield when he was previously there, got him to Norwich, the Spanish connection. But there's no doubt that version of science in the Potteries was quite removed from what we've seen the other side of a block of games which got him the Championship Player of the Month, and deservedly so. What was it, 9 goal contributions in 9 going into yesterday, and he had a key role in the goal, to be honest, if not an assist. But there's no doubt they did, from that aspect, yes, blunt some of Norwich's real potent attacking options in the final third, which was good, and we'll get into it in due course, I'm sure, that a player like Antti Cernak could then step up, chip in, because it's been Science and it's been Sargent primarily who've had to carry that burden, and they will need to be less reliant on those two as we move forward if they're going to achieve their objectives this season or maybe next season. But yeah, they did condense the pitch. That was noticeable. I think Pelach touched on his post-match that if you do that, it's very hard for maybe a Thorup style of play to navigate a path through. But I'd go back to that first half. They didn't have any trouble at all playing through. Numerous examples where they did and got the other side. And as I say, that for me, then it tips more to, maybe that sharpness and that clinicalness, which we'd seen prior to the international break, wasn't there. I mean, there was one example, it was very early on, where there was lovely passage of play from some of those midfielders. Ball goes into Sargent. His first touch, the ball goes 5, 6, 7 yards away from his body. Chance gone. And, that in itself, in microcosm, probably underlines that he wasn't quite physically or mentally. And why would he be, given his workload and his travel schedule in recent days? And all those elements flow into then what maybe Stoke did on their side of the ledger, and Pelach and a very well-drilled approach to trying to at least blunt some of what Norwich were doing. But I still think, purely on what we saw in that first half and how that unfolded, if Norwich had brought the attacking edge we saw against Watford and Hull at home, Norwich get 2, get 3, get 4, and then that game goes the same way. So I think there's a balance when we analyse. Was it Stoke managed to blunt Norwich, or was it that to a point, but also combined with maybe Norwich as a collective not quite, understandably, being at their sharpest?
Yeah, agreed, and I think that's a natural point of analysis to make when we sort of go through the game chronologically. When you look at that first half and basically how they faded throughout the game, and there were, I think, pretty noticeably some players who were leggy either physically or mentally. You could see that, and so then it's probably. Well, I'm probably left to compare it with what we saw at Swansea, which was quite different in terms of Norwich probably beat themselves that day. It was a real frustrating day in terms of them not taking their own opportunities, and there were quality points. But the overall performance was a little bit off colour in South Wales compared to maybe now what we've seen over 10 games. This was probably the same, wasn't it? That second half in a microcosm is probably enough mitigation to sort of put the whole afternoon in perspective, because it was one where Norwich looked tired. They didn't look as slick. They weren't playing with the same intensity, and they do when, in Johannes Thorup system and the way that he wants to play, it demands high intensity play, it demands focus, it demands sharpness. And when you don't have all of those things, you can get a performance like we saw in the second half yesterday. And that, as Paddy has referenced, is a byproduct probably of the period that we've just come out of in 2 weeks of international games.
Yeah, I think it's something that Thorup actually has sort of highlighted himself previously in press conferences, and probably a few people who have more eyes on the numbers have noticed as well, that in terms of the physical productivity, Norwich are doing a lot more than most championship sides. Their players are getting through a lot more running and producing a lot more physical numbers. And to be able to produce that without having tired halves like there were, in the second half yesterday, I think takes time. So there probably will be a few of those thrown in. As you mentioned, Swansea was probably quite a good example of that. Yesterday certainly was. And I think you could tell from the pace with which Norwich moved the ball at times, for me, in the first half as well, but certainly in the second half, it does need that intensity to be able to find those passes, especially off the ball. You need players to be at peak fitness to be able to create those options. But it felt like as the game wore on, that Norwich were fighting a battle a little bit with some of the problems that they had fitness-wise and with the travel that a lot of those players have been through. And that meant that too often it looked pretty static. There wasn't much interchanging of movement. There weren't many spaces found because Stoke actually were able to just sit in their block without having to react to much that they weren't really expecting. So, yeah, I thought that was borne out in the performance, but equally, I think we can't underestimate the impact of losing Marcelino Nunez, and I'm sure it was something we were going to come on to. But you look at the stark contrast between that first half and the second half, and the main word is control that Norwich lost from that first half to the second half. And although a lot of what we talk about in the midfield, and it feels like it's an increasing part of the rhetoric around Norwich City, is physicality, you need someone in there who is just calm, assured, will move the ball quickly, can see the game 3 or 4 passes ahead. And although Kenny McLean and Anis Ben Slimani both cover a lot of ground, they've both got a decent amount of technical ability, it doesn't feel like they have that same picture of the game that Nunez has, and that ability to almost dictate the tempo of it. And I thought losing him at halftime had a huge impact. I don't really feel like, regardless even of the quality of their performance, which I didn't think was great, but when you bring on the likes of Amankwa Forson and Oscar Schwartau, neither of those is really especially like Nunez. Even Emiliano Marcondes, who I actually thought played fairly well, is a completely different profile of player. So that's the concern for me going forward, is that they don't really have a direct replacement for Nunez. And you could certainly see how important he is to that team based on that second half performance.
Were you surprised that he started, Paddy? Because as I think we said throughout the international break, particularly in that first week, obviously pre-scan and obviously thankfully things improved to the extent where he could start. But certainly the mood music initially after he pulled out of the Chile squad and whatnot was that he was going to be out for weeks. Maybe even this entire block of games between international breaks. So the fact he was in a position to start, I guess, is a huge positive. But then you see him go down after 45 minutes and I think it probably does, and we're not medical professionals by any stretch of the imagination. There are people far better qualified to speak about it than us. But it did feel to me maybe like a big risk starting him, given everything that's unfolded over the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, again, we're having this discussion with the benefit of hindsight now. I mean, when he was bursting into the box and really probably should have beaten Victor Janssen with that chance that Slimani served up, or even then 2 minutes after that, it was his corner, McLean header, another excellent save from Johansson. So, if he has that sort of impact and they win the game, then you probably flip the other side, don't you? So it's a conversation we're filtering through hindsight. I think it probably cuts to Sam's point that he is that important. He is that influential. He is not one of a kind, but in terms of how the Dane wants to construct the way Norwich move from back to front, he is without doubt the foremost candidate, exponent of that. It's just natural to his game, and it was maybe underlined with some of the other players who come into those positions in the field. it's not as seamless. It doesn't feel as natural as it does when Nunez is in there. So we'll know. Well, I mean, that's the reality we're dealing with now, that he has gone down, and it is, as Johannes confirmed after the game, the same pain that he felt in the same hamstring against Hull, and did it as well. Worth pointing out, early on in that Hull game. You know, it wasn't something that he felt right at the end of the Hull game. He, by all accounts, felt it early on, was able in his mind to play through, but that's probably not from a physiological and a sports science point of view. It's done him many favours, because then subsequently he's out of Chile's friendlies, but he's also out of most of that 2 weeks of training. He only came back last Thursday, then Friday. That was enough in Johannes's mind, clearly, that he could start him. And in that first 40 minutes, there was no sense watching him and how he was dictating that game, and the elements of already those key moments of reference, that he was inhibited by anything fitness wise. But sadly, that turned out to be the case, and now, you know, we're kind of this side of the scan. We'll speak to Yanis on Monday afternoon. Now we'll get an update. I don't think that there's any chance that he's available for Preston, even if it's another positive scan update. I just think that's too much of a risk. Talking about risk and weighting the risk. It's, for me, how many of these games, and do we, having had that Stoke reprieve, do we end up at that timeline, heaven forbid, where we don't see him again until the other side of November's round of fixtures? Because that would be a blow. And immediately then, Johannes and Glenn and his coaching team need to come up with something that is not a like for like, because I think we're pretty much of the same opinion. There isn't a natural replacement for Nunez, but something that can offset what he gives you in terms of his passing range, in terms of his set pieces, in terms of how he injects that dynamism into their play and that transitional part of the template. For me, I'll open this debate up to you boys. I'd go Slimani there for Tuesday night, because I think he is the nearest to what Nunez could offer in terms of his ability on the ball, his vision, his technical ability. There might be question marks around maybe some of the dynamism, the box-to-box element. I don't think he's necessarily got that. And to go back a little bit further, remember when he came in, he's coming off not a huge amount of football last season. Johannes talking about when he's had his sort of fitness issues since coming to Norwich, that he needs to almost build his body up again to have that robustness to handle what we're in now, a 3-game week. So, of course, you would have concerns about that. But I just think from the technical element and trying to sort of replicate what Nunez offers, if it is a case we get to Tuesday night, Preston, Nunez isn't available, who goes in there? For me, it's Slimani, and then probably Schwartau comes into Slimani's place in terms of that midfield three alongside McLean. But, I mean, I'll throw that one back to you, boys. If, hypothetically, and it looks likely, no Nunez, who's your midfield three for Preston?
Oh, it's a good question. So I've got a funky answer, which maybe I'll save until after Sam spoke. But I think if we go in direct without changing a lot of other elements, then I'm probably with you. I think I push Slimani up and have Schwartau in, just because I think I'm not sure Forson's quite there yet from a confidence perspective. And I still want to just sort of bed him in slowly. I think obviously Marcondes, who probably becomes the other candidate, we don't get the sense that he is fitness wise in a position where maybe he can start a championship game. But I'll throw it over to Sam, and then I'll sell you my very funky idea that I've got in my well, maybe it's not that funky, I don't know. But Sam, what's your midfield mix, providing that Nunez is missing on Tuesday, as we suspect?
Yeah, more or less. I think I agree with your summing up of things. Really, it's a shame that Forson is in this current moment, because we've seen, the qualities that he has, and he feels like he's somebody who more easily can slot into that midfield. Maybe he's not a Nunez type, but I think with him and Slimani and McLean in there, it would be a more Thorup type midfield and more of an accurate replacement of what we've seen in the last few games. But I agree that, confidence wise, now isn't the time to just drop him in there. I think based on form and recent performances, Marcondes would be in there for me. But, like you, I think it's probably too early fitness wise, given it was so long between competitive matches for him. It wasn't an especially long cameo against Hull, even though it was quite an impressive one. Then to have 26 minutes against Stoke yesterday, and then all of a sudden 3 days later to be in that Preston starting 11, I think would be quite the demand. But it's interesting that we're already in this position, given Marcondes was somebody who wasn't even really on the radar following the end of the transfer window, and now it looks like he almost would be up there with the best options for Norwich. But if I was predicting what Thorup will do, I think it will be Schwartau in there, because he's been a lot of the games the first substitute off the bench. He's clearly somebody who Thorup trusts, probably someone who looks a little bit raw at the moment and does need to do a bit more work for me to be a regular starter, and probably even to be someone who can make that big of an impact for Norwich. But right now, he looks like somebody who Thorup certainly trusts. It's not an easy decision, I don't think, to replace Nunez, but I think he will go for Schwartau. Yeah,
agreed. But here's something that I've been conjuring up. And on also, I think probably the wider theme of the fact that I think realistically they're going to have to make changes to this game on Tuesday anyway. It's a 3-game week, a lot of players who have been away. So my thought process is to change to a back three. And so I'll spell you the team that I'm thinking, and then maybe I'll explain it. So you'd have Long in goal. You'd have a back three of Duffy, Cordoba, Doyle. Wing backs, Krizene and Stacey, midfield 2 of McLean and Slimani, and then a 3 of Sienat, Sainz, Sargent. So you retain that attacking 3. It does mean that you lose a body out of midfield, which I think numerically would cause maybe a little bit of challenge, but maybe that does allow Doyle to then step in on occasion. It does allow Norwich to still have that width. Sainz can come in. You can then basically play with a mate. You're kind of a front 2 with Sargent and Sienat. So I think on a one-off basis that could offer you something. I don't know if either of you gents have any thoughts on that, but it's just an idea that I'll stick in it. We've seen Norwich use it to chase games a little bit, but I think there is a scenario there that could work. Whether it could work on 2 days training and one of those being a recovery day is probably the question. And I think maybe it strikes to the core that I don't really see Thorup moving away from that 4-3-3, which he seems sort of quite ideologically wedded to.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think there's any chance he actually does that? Because as he said, no. He's done it well. He's done it as a sort of late play to maybe try and get Norwich back into the game or try to see results out so far. But yeah, I'd agree with you that probably ideologically, maybe it's a little bit early in the project for him to try doing that. And we spoke a little bit about this yesterday, but my concern there, and I think a lot of your logic is right, but my concern would be that Thorup's main thing is control. And if you give up a central midfielder, then it's quite hard to control games without numerical superiority or with numerical inferiority in midfield. So that's where my one concern would be. But I do agree that in terms of changing things up a little bit, freshening things up, and probably also getting his better players in the team with Nunez out injured, that probably would work. But yeah, I would be surprised if we see it at Preston, to be honest.
And there's a continuity point as well, because Norwich have a degree of momentum. So then to pivot in a completely different direction and change shape, I think would be a risk. But I think it would allow you to create some of the same structures. So we've seen them at points, particularly when Jack Stacey has been in the side, build up with that back three, Doyle, Cordoba, Duffy. Well, they'd do that pretty naturally. You could then, if you wanted to, have Krizene stepping into kind of that second line of build up. If you wanted, you could add Stacey to the third line. Sainz then has a little bit more of a role to come central, and then perhaps you can gain that sort of superiority in the middle. So I think there is a potential idea there to craft. Whether this is the exact moment to maybe deploy that, I'm not sure. But yeah, I think I don't know what Paddy thinks, but I think I don't really see them doing that. It's just an idea I thought I'd put out there as maybe a potential option. Pad?
Was it Stacey on the right or Fisher?
Stacey, yeah. I only because I think if you want wing backs, then that you need a bit more vertical running width. I think this is probably a game against Preston where you can have a bit more license to do that, I think, rather than perhaps what they faced on Saturday. And then obviously you could then bring Fisher in as well. But it's harsh on him, isn't it? But I think as well, probably those full-back areas, wing-back areas are where I'm looking at for maybe a little bit of rotation.
Yeah, but I mean, it's so important, that inverted element of which has underpinned this upturn in recent games, and to take Fisher out of that, I don't think. Take your point about could Krizene/Doyle offer that up. It's a lot of experimentation in a very short period of time, mate. So I think, respectfully, I can't see that. But the point is proven, and it's been underlined now that he's going to have to freshen up. purely in terms of the personnel and the bodies, because off the back of Saturday, but also now another long haul back to Norfolk, back up again. They can't really be doing too much in the next day or two more than recovery, and then you've got another game at the end of the week. So I think it's inevitable. There will be changes in personnel, but shape-wise, not sure I see that at this stage, because it is still very much, if this was 12 months down the line and things are almost completely intuitive and his players understand intrinsically what he's all about, then you might see a little bit more tactical evolution, I think, from him. But yeah, as you boys have said, when we've seen the back three, it's either shoring up a result or it's trying to chase a result. So I don't necessarily see his go-to from the off being that approach. But changes, yes, in personnel, but for me, not shape.
Yeah, I do agree. I do agree. It was just something I thought I'd share. Just to bounce back to you, Paddy. George Long obviously came in yesterday for Angus Gunn, who is going to be out. I think we expect for at least these games this week. Hopefully no longer, but potentially beyond that Middlesbrough game next Sunday. How do you think he did? Because I think I've seen some what I feel is quite harsh criticism for the goal. I can kind of understand maybe why some people have highlighted a potential positional point, but equally, how slow are Norwich to close down Manhuff in the first place, and then he uses Doyle, I think, as a little bit of a shield. So I don't think he sees it at the best of times. He's had to shift across his goal, but I think overall there were some really good elements, the sweeper elements, the distribution elements. There was some good points, and probably more good than bad from George Long. I felt.
Oh yeah, we wouldn't disagree at all. On the goal, yeah, I think his positioning, you can question it. He's quite far out of his goal, but equally, by no manner of means would I be apportioning the volume of blame, if we want to talk in those terms, to him. I mean, Doyle has got attracted infield to about Berger, if you watch it back again, which is Cordoba's man. Why he's made that choice, and then he's clearly then making up ground and doesn't quite get there. And it is a very good finish from a quite highly rated young player, it would seem. So there are elements that Norwich would look at and I'm sure examine and know they could do better. But it for me, that is George Long's part of that equation. I don't think he is the only part. And yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a couple of decent stops. There was one in the first half we touched on early from Tom Cannon. There was another one from Andrew Moran, I think, in the second half, in that sort of bright spell from Stoke, where he's had to get down and grasp it at the second attempt. But that for me was the standout, was his ability on the floor, because it is so key. With that triumvirate almost with the two centre backs, that build up structure and setting the tone and not being, as Johannes has talked about with the centre backs, but not being panicked when you do get pressed. And Stoke did press, and Pelach made it quite clear after the game that was a key element he wanted to see from his side. So there was an aggressiveness to their press, but that said, I think George Long seemed to be quite comfortable in that scenario. So that bodes well. And I put that direct. I mean, you spoke to him, Connor, but I asked Johannes for his thoughts on George Long's performance, and he was of the same opinion. He thought if he continues at that level, there will be genuine competition when Gunny is fit and available again, and that's a testament to him. And he referenced again as they did around that new deal recently, what just a great individual he is, the ultimate professional, supporting younger players, supporting Gunny and the other keepers. And but now it's his time. We said on the team news at the ground before the game, this is now his time. It seems at this stage of the week, he's got yesterday, he's got Tuesday, and then he's got Saturday to put down a marker. Saturday was his first league start for Norwich since November of last year. So he's had to bide his time. He's had to be patient. But now, through Gunny's sadly misfortune on the injury front, he's got a window to really put down a marker. And if he continues in the same vein as he did against Stoke, then at least Johannes has a thought process, rather than Gunny comes back fit, Gunny goes back into that 11. And that's what he wants. He wants that outfield-wise across the pitch, but he also probably wants it in terms of his keeper stocks, because it's good for Gunny as well, isn't it? If he actually genuinely feels that his place could be under threat now from his understudy. So, yeah, a little bit harsh for me if anybody really wants to dig George Long out, while acknowledging maybe there was elements he could have done better in that particular moment. But let's hope that's a good benchmark for the rest of the week.
Yeah, agreed. I think there is I want to be a little bit careful because I don't think it's a majority, but I think there is a faction of people who maybe every single goal that Norwich concede with George Long in goal want to really analyze every individual facet of his position or his movement or what he's done. I think it's a very difficult role because he has not played, as you said, it hasn't started a league game since November. You then get dropped in relatively cold. You then have to pick up the speed of a game, having not played for a long period. You don't really get opportunity to build up a run of form or a run of games. That there's no real confidence or any sort of base that you're going from. It's a really difficult thing, I think, to be dropped in to that position. And I think if you're going to talk about the position for the goal, I think is valid. Could he have had a better position? Yes, he could have, and that's the long and short of it. But equally, again, and you touched upon it there was a lot that he did do very well. I thought the sweeper elements was as good as I've seen him in terms of reading those elements of the game. There was some really good interventions. There was an early cross from the left-hand side which led to a bit of a goal-mouth scramble. He did really well to claw the ball away there. There was a corner that I think actually Josh Sargent flicked on with his head that he managed to beat over the bar. There were some really good moments in there as well. So I think it's I think people can get a little bit fixated on George Long, and I think a lot of the time a little bit unfairly. Is he as good as Angus Gunn? No. Are Norwich in a position where they can have a number two that's as good as Angus Gunn? Also, no, because we saw that with Tim Krul. It's expensive, and it probably is not the best thing for that goalkeeping department in terms of harmony and whatnot. And yeah, I think he maybe doesn't deserve quite as much of the stick that he gets because he plays an important role. And ultimately, is he going to play a lot of games of football for Norwich in the Championship? Probably not. So there we go. I thought he was good yesterday. 4 saves. Yeah, there was some nice moments. So yeah, there we go. That's George Long covered off. Sam, I think in terms of and this maybe is the final point on the game, that period after Norwich scored, because we talked about, I think, the first half performance, which was so good, and where Norwich had a lot of control and whatnot. And to be fair, Nunez had gone off the pitch prior to Norwich's goal as well. But just this 5 minutes of madness after they scored, and I know Thorup was a little bit unhappy because I think 5 minutes was signalled, and somehow we ended up playing for nearly 9. Although Stoke's goal, I think, came in the 6th minute of that allocated time, and it is a minimum of, as we always stress. So I'm sure the referee has his reasons for why he went that long. But ultimately, it was probably a 5 minutes of madness from Norwich, which has cost them 3 points. I would maybe argue.
Yeah, I thought the reaction to the goal was pretty poor, to be honest. We've seen at various points in the recent history of Norwich City how important it is to respond to goals at either end in the right way. I think Norwich have done that actually in the last few weeks, where the start of the season, maybe when they scored, they tended to retreat and there was that natural psychological element that kicked in. I feel like in the games against Hull and Watford especially, that when they scored goals, they actually went and not only did they keep playing the way they were, but they actually looked like they wanted more, and it gave them the impetus to then go and attack even further. And of course, you can't do that forever. You can't do that in the 97th minute when you're 1-0 up. I understand that psychologically that's very, very difficult. But when you've just scored and it's 1-0 and you've only got 5 or 6 minutes, as we thought it was when that added time originally went up, to see that scoreline into half time, I think you need to keep a level head there, and it's probably where you need some of those more experienced heads to actually ensure that their teammates are keeping a level head and not letting the game descend into the sort of madness that we did see for those few minutes. It felt fairly uncharacteristic of what we've seen from Norwich in the last few weeks, and ultimately it has cost them probably 2 points. And of course, you can look at that second half performance. You could say that if it was 1-0, Stoke might even have pushed even harder and they might have equalised anyway. But it does feel like the game would have been entirely different if you go in at half time and Norwich are 1-0 up. And there's probably a load of elements that we're talking about. We're probably never discussing George Long and where he could have improved for that goal. We might be talking a bit more about Ante Cianats and how important that goal was for his career. But yeah, they just didn't respond in the right way. They let Stoke get a bit of momentum, where actually at that point it was all with Norwich. They had married the the performance with the scoreline, and it looked like everything was headed in the right direction. So it's hard to put a finger on that when they seem to have sorted that out in the last few games, and I'm sure it's an area that Thorup will be really, really frustrated with. But also, you know, at the moment, a lot of it is about learning, and I'm sure after that, the next time Norwich do take the lead, they probably will respond a bit better, because that was textbook in terms of how to react in the wrong way, to be honest.
Yeah, got goals, and because football is such a low-scoring game, it's an obvious statement. We hear it a lot, but goals have a significant impact on games and game states and the way that teams adapt to both of those. But this is so I've got a list of shots in front of me here. So you've got Antti Sienat's goal on 45 minutes, which, and we'll come on to maybe what that does for him in a moment. But then and this is prior to Manhoff scoring. 45 plus 1, Manhoff has a shot off target. 45 plus 6, Thomas Cannon has one that is Tom Cannon, sorry, has one that is blocked. 45 plus 6 again, Cannon again, header off target, he sort of glanced it away from goal, didn't he? And then 45 plus 6 is when Manhoff scores. So we're not just talking about a 5-minute spell, we're talking really about a spell where Norwich conceded 3 shots on their goal in a minute of football, which didn't happen throughout the rest of the game. Really, I think that perfectly kind of encapsulates, Sam, what you're sort of alluding to there, which is just how chaotic that half finished. And maybe, and look, we'll never know how the second half pans out if Norwich go into that game leading as opposed to level, but it did just give Stoke some momentum, I felt. So yeah, that's an interesting point. And then Paddy, I guess we have to come on to Antti Sienats, his first goal for the club. It feels like it's been probably a long time coming for him, and I think we have seen improvement over him. And to be fair, the type of goal that it is, it feels like that's probably exactly what it was going to be and what he needed, where it was a little bit of pinball. Schwartau's shot hits Josh Sargent in the face. He expertly guides it into the path of Sienats, but it's some finish, isn't it? And I think that maybe illustrates what we thought of, or what everyone maybe has thought of his early Norwich City performances, that there is a player there waiting to be unlocked. And the hope now will be that this goal, this moment, really does that for him from an output perspective.
Very much so, yeah. I just want footnote on that previous conversation there, boys, because 9 of the 10 games in the Championship, Norwich have took the lead. 9 of the 10. They've been pegged back 4 times. Yeah. Blackburn, Sheffield United, Leeds, and now Stoke. So that does tell you there is.
So we could just to pick up on that. You could look at that both ways. You could say there's maybe a game management issue in terms of Norwich City seeing out leads or building on leads. On the flip side, you could say it's really positive that they get themselves in that position. It shows that they're doing a lot of stuff well. So maybe the answer is somewhere between the two.
Yeah, but I think ultimately, in terms of an evolutionary path and wanting to get better, they need to turn those 4 games that got turned in the other way, i.e. they ended up settling for a point. They need to get, and it's unrealistic to think they would have took the lead 9 times, and they're not Man City, with the greatest respect. They're not going to close out the vast majority at this stage of their development. And I think Johannes was kind of alluding to that yesterday, actually, after the game, that will come. All of that is tied up in players understanding what they need to do in certain game states, being the ability to react, the ability to detect that they may be going into that period that you boys talked about just before Stoke equalised, and what can they do to mitigate it. And I guess it's shared, learned experience. The more of these games now that they can get their noses in front and see them out, as they did in 5 of those 9 occasions, then the more confidence you feel when you're faced with a similar scenario again. But that does tell you, probably just cuts to the heart of what this is, which is still very, very much an embryonic work in progress, and that it's unrealistic to expect. And we spent a lot of the international podcast about how quickly this has come together, and almost to a remarkably fast degree. But maybe Stoke was just a reminder that within that there are clearly facets that are going to take a little while longer to become almost intuitive, almost enshrined in terms of how Norwich are, home or away, how they handle the various scenarios they're going to play out. But parking that and moving on to Sienats, Johannes asked him directly after the game and said a couple of really interesting things. Actually, he said that would be a little bit of a weight off his shoulders, and that he needs to now kick on. He's almost broken the seal, and And we'll see maybe the upside of that in terms of the confidence. You saw his reaction, the beaming smile, the congratulations of his teammates. They were as happy for him, it felt, as he was himself getting off the mark. But Giannis did also throw in that, Glenn Riddlesome had sat down with him during this past week and talked about, come on, we need a bit more. We need, this adaptation process. We're happy with a lot of the elements we're seeing in your game, but almost an appreciation. And Giannis said that Ante himself offered this in that chat with Glenn, that it is a very different speed of game in where he's come from, Polish football to the English Championship, the intensity, the need to act in terms of thought process and on the pitch a lot quicker, and dealing with that and building that into his game, basically. All of that was good to hear, because I think we from the outside watching would say you've seen, certainly in this last 5 or 6 games, positive signs from Ante Cernach. And it was still evident yesterday, even with that very good finish, that there was moments, Shane Duffy found him in midfield. He just needs to turn, get the ball out of his feet, and then there's a real promising counter, and he just dallied enough to be dispossessed. Those fractions of a second where he might have got more time, obviously, in the Polish leagues. He's not going to get that in the English Championship, and it's how quickly he can assimilate that is the case and adapt his game accordingly, because the raw material, I think, is there, and it was shown in the technical ability that, okay, he had plenty of time, but sometimes that's not a great thing when you've got the ball spinning to you in the box and you have to think about it. But it was a very controlled finish. His show reel from Polish football last season would tell you he has that goal scoring ability. The big question is, can Giannis and Glenn extract that on a regular basis? And that's his challenge, as it is Borja Sainz on the opposite flank. But we do have to remember this is a 20-year-old who, irrespective of the fee, which has got nothing whatsoever to do with him, that was club to club, parachuted into England, the whole off-the-pitch element of that, a young man in a new country, new culture, but then you overlay that you're actually getting parachuted into an ultra-competitive championship where every game is a test, it's a battle, you have to come through that. And then once you've done that, then you can show your quality. And it'll be interesting now what that does to him. Does it unlock something in him? And we start to see the goals and the assists to go with some of the positive play and general play. And if we see that, then you've got Sainz, you've got Sargent. If you get Cernach getting up to something of a contributory nature, that front three, would you swap that anywhere else in the Championship? Maybe Leeds. But on the evidence of the games I've seen and the teams Norwich have played, I would take Norwich's front three over any other front three in this division, because it's got a little bit of everything. And he's only going to get better. 2 very young men, either side of Sargent, who himself isn't old, but has a lot of, Championship pedigree now. So, yeah, you just hope it's a watershed moment and that we're looking back now, maybe the other side of November's international break, and he's really, really stepped up in terms of the contribution in goals and assists, rather than, it's a shaft of light and then we get a bit more of what we got prior to yesterday, which is, he's not quite at the level. And I don't think anybody's suggesting he is at the level right now, but as with all the business they did over the summer, Marcondes aside, they were signing what they felt are players with potential who can get better, who are maybe undervalued in the markets they went and got them. And that might be a moot point when you pay reportedly $8+ million. But if he does catch, wrote about it in my pointers, and at his age and his profile and where he plays on the pitch, if he does catch, $8 million will look cheap.
Yeah, agreed. And picked up some really interesting quotes from Poland, reflecting on him and his time in the country. I was only there for 12 months, but he had a similarly slow start last season at Rakow when he moved to Poland. So, and I think he sort of exploded into life around this sort of time, maybe slightly later. And that's when they really felt they had a talent on their hands. But he is the first Norwich City player other than Borja Sainz to score a goal on the road this season. So that's nice for him, I guess. And of course, this game, I think, Sam, is particularly interesting to reflect on a wider sort of start to Norwich City season, because it's game 10, which is where people tell you can begin to sort of look at league tables and very briefly try and discern what they mean and whatnot. I've had a look this morning. So Norwich obviously sit in 7th as it stands. and will be heading into Preston, I think. Just having a look down the table. Yeah. So it's obviously 4 wins, 4 draws, 2 defeats, 17 goals scored, 11 conceded. It's a points per game rate at the moment of 1.6, which if you extrapolate that across the whole season, they would end up on 74 points, which is a point more than what they had last season under David Wagner. So that's, I think, some useful context. And equally, if you look at some of the underlying numbers, mainly around sort of expected goals for and against at the moment, the difference between them would have them as the 4th best team in the division, behind Millwall, Middlesbrough and Leeds. So again, whether you want to take something from that or whether you don't, but it shows the underlying data essentially is good at this moment in time. But all of that, Sam, I think paints a pretty encouraging picture of a team that is young, first and foremost, which I think maybe does lean into a little bit that conversation we had about Norwich City being able to get themselves into leads and into good positions, and then maybe lacking the nous and whatnot to see it through or to manage tough periods within games. But equally, for a team that is supposedly in transition, and they definitely are, I think all of that stuff that I've listed there, coupled with obviously the league table, the points return, 16 points after 10 games. I mean, that's pretty good, isn't it, for where they're at this moment in time? It's obviously only 2 defeats in 10. It's 1 defeat in 7 for them. All of those things paint a pretty positive picture of where Johannes Thorup's team is at this moment in time.
Yeah, well, if you start considering the league table, then you'd say at this point Norwich would be in that playoff race. And I think if you said to anyone going into the start of the season, Norwich will be, if not in that top 6, then they'll be in and around, and they'll have a chance of competing with those teams this season. The large majority of Norwich fans would have been, very pleased with that. And at this stage of the sort of the transition, as you said, it is. That's quite surprising, because I think we all thought that it would start off quite poorly, and we maybe felt that the opening day loss to Oxford was an indicator of how hard it would be to start off with, and then towards the end of the season we'd see the signs of what Thorup eventually wants to achieve with Norwich. So if you take that curve and you apply it to where they are now, they should end up, much better than they are currently, which would suggest, quite comfortably in the playoffs. And I know it's not as easy as that. It's not as simple as that. And as much as people say you can start looking at the league table after 10 games, it is still extremely early. What's interesting for me is that now I think they've got this period of typical Championship football where some of those players will go through the ringer a little bit, and some of those players who have arrived might find themselves a little bit surprised by the idiosyncrasies of the Championship and some of the unique elements that maybe they haven't experienced before. You wrote a column about that going into Stoke, and it did feel like quite an apt start to this period, because although maybe some of the cliches around that club aren't necessarily going to be true for much longer under Narcis Pelach, the whole cliche of going to Stoke and the difficulties that provides were, I think they apply to the next few weeks. So for me, the real test is coming up. A lot of Saturday, Tuesdays, a lot of away games, as we've spoken about, and maybe as we aren't going to enjoy over the next few weeks too much. But I think how Norwich emerge from this period, I'm looking maybe after Christmas rather than the international break, because they come around so fast now. But how they emerge after Christmas, I think, will be really interesting and probably tell us a lot about how this side is coping with this transition. Because, as I said, they've got a lot of elements to adapt to that maybe they haven't had to face in the early weeks and months of the season. So I'm interested to see how they adapt, how that style of football translates to maybe these more difficult elements. But so far you can't complain, because I think they're ahead of the curve in terms of that development, and they're definitely doing a lot better than I think most people expected they would be at this stage.
Yeah, agreed. I don't think the league table is fully settled yet. I think there's some teams in higher positions that maybe are slightly running a little bit hot at this moment in time. I think there are teams slightly lower down the table, and the numbers, I think, back that up, to be fair, that are maybe a little bit lower down than perhaps what they should be. And dare I say, Pad, I think Cov are probably one of those, to be fair, looking at some of their data, which isn't maybe as bad as some of the results have been. So, as you say, it's still such a small sample, but I think you have to take encouragement from performances, but equally what the data is showing you, and the data's painting a pretty encouraging picture, which is matching probably what we're seeing with our eyes. And the reality is, if Norwich can extrapolate more of that first half against Stoke than perhaps the second half in games going forward at Preston, at Cardiff, at Sheffield Wednesday, which we've all got trips to those before the next international break in November, then you would really hope that they can extract more points on the road than what they've done. I think what's really encouraging so far is that I think Thorup is one win short of what David Wagner achieved in 2024 in terms of away wins in such a smaller sample. Norwich only won 6 games on the road last year. They've already won 2, so that's maybe a good indication that we are going to see improvement on that front as well. So yeah, pretty good at the moment is probably where we'd say Norwich are. I don't think we're going to get a huge amount of time to speak about the accounts, but me and Sam did, if you want a bit more of a detailed discussion on it, me and Sam did discuss it in the preview show to this game, which is on our YouTube channel. If you want to go and have a little dissection of that, we've got a piece on the website as well explaining what it means in a little bit more detail. So let's come to Jack Wilshere then, Paddy, which is probably not a name that we were expecting to discuss on this podcast maybe a couple of weeks ago, but such is where we're at with Norwich City. They've obviously been in the market and aptly because we've just seen Narcis Pelach and Stoke. They've been in the market for his replacement now for a month or so since Pelach left to join Stoke. And from what we gather, it's going to be someone very well known, former Arsenal player, of course, responsible for what was one of the best team goals in Premier League history against Norwich City all those years ago. England international, really good pedigree as a player, still only 32, and it looks like he's set to join Norwich City. So, what are your thoughts on that and him potentially joining Yannis Thorup's backroom team?
Well, first and foremost, fantastic sourcing from you, young man. So fair play on that with the original story, but. Despite what you may have heard elsewhere across social media, we don't need to get into that. But you saw the reaction once we dropped it. Can't think what day it was now, Thursday, wasn't it? For those reasons you stated, his pedigree in the game as a player, okay, not as a coach, but one of that generational talents, and sadly injury. Only observing from a distance, if I'm honest, but it looks like injuries really curtailed what he could have gone on to achieve. Even allowing for what he did achieve, playing for Arsenal, playing for England, funny enough, I mean, completely unconnected now, but I flagged it to Sam actually earlier in the week when we did a profile on him. I was just watching outspoken individual on TalkSport, Simon Jordan. He does a very good podcast series, and he had Jack Wilshere on there. I watched it earlier in the year. A real kind of no holds bars, as you would imagine, with Simon Jordan asking the questions, and he's obviously had the highs, but he's had the lows in his career, and yet he probably could have chosen easier paths than going back into the game and trying to be a coach. But that maybe cuts to he just loves the game. And at heart, that's why he came through as early as he did. There was comparisons with that tremendous Barcelona midfield when he first burst on the scene. Is this England's Xavi? Is this England's Iniesta? That's how good he was as a player. But that I'm sure. If/when it gets confirmed, and our latest information from speaking to people at the game on Stoke was it'll be the other side of Preston when we're actually able to say Jack Wilshere is part of Yannis's backroom team. But I'm sure when we do get the opportunity to speak to him, he will be pretty dismissive of, well, that was Jack Wilshere the player. I'm now Jack Wilshere the coach. Judge me on this. And by all accounts, Mikel Arteta said some very positive things about him at his pre-match just before the weekend about what an influence he's been inside the club as a coach and that kind of guiding light with the under-18s. I did have a look earlier today, actually. They funnily enough, they lost their first game of the season, Arsenal's under-18s. They played at home to Aston Villa's 18s at the weekend and lost 4-2. I couldn't actually see any sort of reference to he was there and present, but I presume he would have been. There was reports that would be his last game. Bizarrely, where do Arsenal's under-18s pitch up this coming Saturday? They're at Colney Training Centre. Playing Norwich's under-18s. So we might have a bit of a Narcis Pelach situation in terms of the inside track, albeit at 18s level. But if everything goes to plan, then Jack Wilshere won't be at Colney this coming Saturday. He'll be part of Yannis's backroom team for the next. Who have they got this Saturday? I've completely lost track.
Sunday, Middlesbrough on Sunday.
Oh, well, then there you go. He probably will be at the Colney Training Centre. Yeah, you're right. Sunday, a week today, isn't it? So But there's no doubt it's an exciting feel to this appointment because of his pedigree as a player, and you can't disassociate the two, But if I'm a Norwich player, particularly if I'm a Norwich midfield player, Jack Wilshere's telling me something on the training pictures of Colney, you're listening. Imagine Schwartau, for example, what it would be to work with a player, a coach that's walked in his shoes, as it were, and even the older guys. I'm sure the Kenny McLeans of this world, and maybe one or two others would the respect that he would instantly command goes without saying because of his stature in the game. So, yeah, it's another signal really how progressive Norwich are being in terms of whether it's player recruitment, whether it's what they're trying to do off the pitch. Obviously, this is a big week coming up now in terms of the board level final transfer of power. We all expect that to go through in the EGM. But also in terms of the coaching, they lost Andy Hughes. They've gone and brought in Nick Stanley from Brighton. They've gone and got formerly of AC Milan, Tony Roberts, to replace Paul Clements. And now it would seem, barring a very, very late twist, Jack Wilshere will be Narcis's replacement. And, there's a Danish dimension, isn't there? Because he finished his playing career. And I think Chris Scorum tweeted that his final game as a player, was it for AB, I think, in Denmark, was against Torup's Nordsjælland. So wherever you look, there's a lot of crossovers. I mean, obviously, it would seem from everything you would hear and everything that would seem evident that it's Ben Napper who's driven this with his Arsenal connection. So he will know full well what Jack Wilshere's all about and what he can bring in a coaching capacity. And yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see that dynamic. Jack and Glenn, I can't wait to see that double act.
Do you know who his manager was in Denmark as well?
Hit me.
David Nielsen. Former Norwich City striker as well, of course. I don't think they won a game during his spell in Denmark, so he might not want to talk about that too much. But other than that, it's there's a couple of nice points there. There's a couple of things that I want to talk about this, because I think first and foremost, I think it says and speaks volumes about Jack Wilshere and his desire and ambition in the coaching world to take this step, because this isn't the easy route, right? As you mapped out, the easy one is to stay at Arsenal, where he's comfortable, he's in an environment that he knows, he's got a pretty good gig. Let's be honest, the under-18s role at Arsenal, you're working with some incredibly talented individuals, a lot of whom go to have brilliant careers, be it Arsenal or elsewhere in the EFL. I think you worked with Amari Hutchinson. He was at Arsenal, wasn't he? The lad who's at Ipswich and then went to Chelsea. So I think he's worked with him and a couple of others as well. So there's some really good examples of young players that he's worked with there. That's a good gig to with the greatest will in the world, to give that up to come to Norwich, not as the main man, but as part of the coaching team, I think speaks about how much he wants to improve himself and experience different environments. So that first and foremost. But equally, and I think this is maybe a point that hasn't really been spoken about, and you sort of list the coaching team there, Paddy. I mean, this is not just a new Norwich City 11 on the pitch. That's a completely new coaching team. All of them have never worked with each other before, outside of Norwich City. Even Thorup and Riddlesholm, who clearly have the Danish connection there, but they never worked together in a professional setting before coming here. Nick Stanley as well, and it's young. And I think something that Norwich probably haven't done as well at in recent years is probably developing coaches. They've got a lot of praise for developing players, but actually how many coaches of other teams come and knocked on the door, and head coaches as well. Obviously, Paul Lambert was the last that left for any sort of compensation. That is a real market that I think they could do a lot better in terms of developing coaches that can be developed and move on to bigger clubs, as they have done, to be fair, with Andy Hughes, with Narcis Pelach and Paul Clements. That is a source of income. So yeah, I don't underestimate that element of it as well. But it's going to be fascinating. And obviously for Janisov Thorup, he's gone from having Michael Essien as part of his backroom team to now potentially Jack Wilshere. It's that's some Premier League midfield that he's building there, isn't it? So yeah, and as Paddy mentioned, of course, and this is probably the footnote to the pod, really big week for Norwich City off the pitch. EGM on Wednesday, isn't it? Wednesday night, which will give shareholders the opportunity to go, if they haven't done the postal votes, to go down to Carrow Road and vote either for or against the motion that would essentially allow that transition of power to take place in March, if it does go through, which I think is the expectation at this stage. But obviously we need it to be confirmed, and that needs to be confirmed by the third party people who are verifying those votes. Then obviously we would expect Delia and Michael to step down pretty imminently after that vote is passed from the board, which clearly after the reign those two have had, is a massive moment in the history of this football club. So we'll maybe reflect on that a little bit in future weeks, because I think it's not worth cramming in 5 minutes into a podcast to speak about those two. It's one that deserves a lot more conversation and probably nuance than that. So yeah, it's going to be a big week, and of course we've got the trip to Preston on Tuesday night, which Paddy's absolutely delighted about, and yeah, really looking forward to that one. Paddy's just disappointed, I think, that Narcis wasn't as pleased to see him as he was me yesterday. So I think that's the one that's
not at all. Not at all. No, he greeted you like you was blood brother. I've never known such.
I thought I was going to end up with a coaching role, to be honest, at the end of our
I think
conversation.
you might still do if you carry on down that path. Yeah. I could see you doing the set pieces, Connor. No doubt about it. Maybe you were your 3 and 2 wing backs. Maybe we'll see that.
He'd love that. I'm sure he'd love that. Yeah, I'm sure he would.
Yeah.
I'm all for 7-hour tactical meetings, but anyway, we've been going on for over an hour, so that's probably a nice place to
Feels like
leave
7
it.
hours.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for listening. Of course, we'll be at Deepdale on Tuesday. We'll be at Middlesbrough. Well, we'll be following all the events after Preston as well with that EGM, and then we'll be at Middlesbrough on Sunday. Don't forget that. This is mainly for me rather than anyone else. Sunday, so don't turn up at Saturday. 3:00 kickoff against Michael Carrick's team. And of course, if Norwich City avoid defeat in that one, it will see them go a whole year unbeaten at Carrow Road, which is quite the achievement if that happens. So we will, of course, join you after that game to go through all the shenanigans of this week. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you again very soon.